Hi, this is Dr. Mohammed Emran with SpringCure, and we're continuing our series on the 5 food-related risk factors for obesity. Today, we're talking about the glycemic index. So what is the glycemic index? Well, first, let's start by understanding what happens in your body when you eat foods. As you eat, your blood sugar changes over time. The more you eat things that have high sugars in them or sugars that are easily released, the quicker your blood sugar goes up. When your blood sugar goes up, then your body releases insulin, the blood sugar drops, you get to a point of hunger, and then you have to eat again. So when you get hungry at the low blood sugars, that makes you eat, and when your blood sugar gets high, that causes insulin release and that drops. The problem with this is if those blood sugars get too high or too low, then we get into these danger zones where you get high insulin release or excessive hunger, where we end up eating more than we should or having more of our insulin release driving the blood sugar, the sugar into our cells a lot faster than we want it to. The problem with this is when we have excess sugar and excess insulin release, we get fat storage. And when our blood sugar drops too low, we get excessive hunger, which causes overeating. You know those commercials where they say, oh, you're grouchy and you should eat a candy bar? Well, that's what you get when you get at the bottom of these curves, and then you end up eating that candy bar, drive your blood sugar up real high, and that causes insulin release and fat storage, and you repeat the cycle over and over again. It's kind of like Thanksgiving dinner. If you can imagine, everybody has dinner, their blood sugar goes up. 30 minutes later, everybody's on the couch asleep as the insulin is being released, and then their blood sugar drops, and the next thing you know, everybody's back in the kitchen eating again. And you repeat this cycle over and over again of overeating and fat storage. So the glycemic index is how high does a food drive your blood sugar? Because how high your blood sugar is driven is essentially related to how much insulin you're going to get released and how much fat is going to be stored. Glycemic index is measured against pure sugar, which has a glycemic index of 100. So things with a lower glycemic index cause your blood sugar to rise much slower than those that have a higher glycemic index. Glycemic index of 55 or less is considered low glycemic. Things that have a glycemic index of 56 to 69 are considered medium glycemic, and high glycemic is 70 and above. So ideally, what we want to be choosing are low glycemic foods that keep our blood sugar within the safe zone so that we don't get excessive insulin release or excessive hunger driving fat storage or excessive eating. So when we look at common fruits and we look at how many calories per serving, which we've been taught by everybody in the health food industry that was the way to go. You needed to look at your calories and count your calories. You look at how many calories are in some of these fruits. And this doesn't really tell you the whole story. For instance, you look at something like cherries, and it looks like there's a lot of calories per serving compared to something like watermelon. Until we do something interesting. When we look at the glycemic index, suddenly the cherries have a very low glycemic index, and the watermelon has a very high glycemic index, which means that the same cherries that seem to have a lot of sugar actually make your blood sugar go up much, much slower and to a lower degree than the watermelon. And the reality is, how many of us actually eat just one serving of watermelon when we sit down? Most of us are going to have 2 or 3 slices of watermelon, each of which is a serving. When it comes to processed foods, these tend to have much higher glycemic indexes than natural whole foods that have a lot of their fiber and water still in them. So for instance, these muffins have a glycemic index of 60. The bagels there have a glycemic index of 72. And breakfast cereals tend to have a really high glycemic index because they're super refined and oftentimes have added sugar to them. So, for instance, these cornflakes have a whopping 93 glycemic index. Even some of the healthy snacks that people think of, something like pretzels, have a glycemic index as high as 83. And that could be problematic because people think that they're doing something actually good for themselves. The same goes with breakfast cereals. There's a lot of breakfast cereals out there that are touted as healthy, and they actually have very high glycemic indices. Surprisingly, something like potato chips, you can kind of make it out in the background there, are have a lower glycemic index of 51. Their sugars from the starches in the potato are released much slower. Obviously, the more processed those potatoes, the higher the glycemic index. So not all potato chips are the same. And cookies have glycemic indices in the mid-range. Now, those are a little bit deceptive because they have some other properties to them that make them kind of problematic for weight loss, but we'll get to that in other programs. But when we look at just glycemic index, this gives you an idea of where some of the things fall. So what about everything else? Meat in general doesn't have a lot of carbohydrates in it. So there haven't been a lot of studies to figure out what the exact glycemic index is for meats. There are beliefs that certain types of meats drive your blood sugar up a little bit faster than others. For instance, chicken and poultry are believed to drive your blood sugar up slower than, say, red meat and fish. But there's no specific glycemic index assigned to them. Grains, whole grains with the husk on them, tend to have lower glycemic indices than really refined grains. So, for instance, when we talk about rice, if you have a brown rice with as it's cooked, it still has a lot of the fiber in it, and so the glycemic index is much lower than, say, for instance, jasmine rice, which is almost pure starch and drives your blood sugar up very, very quickly. In vegetables, if you have starchy vegetables, such as the root vegetables, those tend to have a little bit higher glycemic index than the more fibrous vegetables, the leafy vegetables, which tend to have much lower glycemic index. Again, because there is very little sugars in the fibrous vegetables, most of these don't actually have an assigned glycemic index because nobody's bothered to do the study because they don't believe there's very much sugar in them overall. Now, one of the dangers that most people don't realize, so we talked about the danger of your blood sugar going up too high and getting insulin release and fat storage and then getting into that cycle of hunger and overeating. One of the other dangers of elevated sugar is what's called glycation. Most people have heard of oxidation, but not everybody has heard of glycation. Glycation can happen for a number of reasons. It can be, you can get substances from foods that you eat, or your body can produce what are called advanced glycation end products from stuff that you eat. And the sugars in the body, when you have just pure sugar in the body that raises your blood sugar, that can actually cause glycation. And what glycation is binding of the sugars or these advanced glycation end products to proteins on the cell surface or certain other substances like cholesterol. And what these do is they cause damage to the proteins in our cell membranes and in our cells, or they cause that cholesterol to become sticky. So, for example, in patients who are diabetic, whose blood sugars may run high, their risk of atherosclerosis or narrowing of the arteries and deposition of cholesterol in those arteries and hardening of the arterial walls is much higher. And the reason is the sugars bind to the proteins in the wall of the blood vessels, making them stiffer and making them stickier on the inside lining. That same stickiness is given to the cholesterol as the glucose or the sugar binds to the surface of the cholesterol. So you have a sticky cholesterol and a sticky blood vessel that's already kind of hardened, and those things bind together, and now you have plaque formation within the blood vessels. So there's more to it than just insulin release and weight gain. There's actually risk for other diseases as well. Now we'll get into advanced glycation end products and glycation and so forth in another talk at a later time, because that's a big subject. But hopefully this helped you understand a little bit more about what the glycemic index is, how it affects our body, and what things we can do to keep the blood sugars from going too high. And we'll join you on the next conversation on our risk factors for obesity.